Imagine a weapon so feared that the medieval church declared it hateful to God. A weapon so powerful it could pierce the finest armor, drop a charging knight from his horse, and turn an untrained peasant into a night killer. This wasn't a sword forged by master smiths, nor a legendary relic carried by kings. It was small, compact, brutally efficient, and it changed warfare forever. This is the story of the medieval crossbow. When it re-emerged in Europe, whispers spread across battlefields. Even the bravest knight can fall to a coward hiding behind a wall. For the first time in centuries, the balance of power shifted. The heavily armored elite, trained since childhood for war, suddenly faced a weapon anyone could learn in a single afternoon. Kings feared it, knights despised it, the church tried to ban it, and yet its bolts kept flying, even claiming the life of Richard the Lionheart himself. Today we dive into the weapon that shattered the feudal order, rewrote the rules of combat, and left an undeniable mark on the Middle Ages. The crossbow, the most revolutionary, controversial, and terrifying weapon of its time. Long before gunpowder thundered across European battlefields, another invention reshaped the art of war, quietly, mechanically, and with ruthless precision. The crossbow or arbalest was not a new idea. Ancient Chinese tombs from the 5th century BC held early versions, and the Greeks once experimented with a belly-fired weapon called the gastrophetes. But it was in medieval Europe that this compact machine reached its true and terrifying potential, becoming one of the most influential weapons of the Middle Ages. Its documented return to Europe in the 10th century, appearing at the Siege of Senlis in 947 and again at Verdun in 984, marked the beginning of a military revolution. By the 12th century, crossbows were everywhere, in castle towers, aboard ships, lining city walls, and carried by mercenaries traveling from battle to battle. What made the crossbow extraordinary wasn't just its mechanical design, but the social earthquake it triggered. In a world dominated by armored knights who trained a lifetime to master their craft, the crossbow placed lethal power into the hands of common soldiers. Anyone, a farmer, a sailor, a town guard, could be taught to fire one within hours, and with a single bolt, they could pierce armor that once symbolized invincibility. This sudden democratization of violence terrified Europe's elite. The church condemned the weapon as unfit for Christians in 1139, even threatening excommunication for those who dared use it against fellow believers. Of course, that didn't stop kings and generals from embracing it on the battlefield. Today we explore how this seemingly simple device transformed warfare, challenged the social order, and helped redefine what power meant in the medieval world. Welcome to Medieval Crazy History, and let's unravel the rise of the crossbow. Part 1. The origins and rise of the crossbow in medieval Europe. When we talk about medieval weapons, the imagination usually jumps to shining swords, charging knights, and longbows arcing across the sky. Yet one of the most influential weapons of the entire Middle Ages didn't begin its life in Europe at all. The crossbow's story stretches far deeper into history, with roots planted long before medieval knights ever strapped on their armor. Archaeologists have uncovered early crossbows in ancient Chinese tombs, dating back to the 5th century BC, sophisticated for their time, and already demonstrating the combination of mechanical ingenuity and deadly efficiency that would later shock Europe. Meanwhile, in the Greek world, inventors experimented with a curious device known as the gastrophetes, the belly bow, a kind of proto-crossbow that relied on a user's torso to load it. These early forms, while primitive compared to what would come later, set the stage for a weapon that would one day shake the foundations of European warfare. But the crossbow's true rise began centuries later, during the chaotic and war-torn world of medieval Europe. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the weapon disappeared from the continent for a time. Then, suddenly, it returned. Its reappearance is first documented in 947 AD at the Siege of Senlis in France, and again in 984 during the Siege of Verdun. These isolated mentions might seem like footnotes, but they signal the quiet beginning of a revolution. By the time of the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the crossbow had already begun spreading rapidly across Europe, and once the Normans brought it to British shores, its popularity exploded. Medieval chroniclers mention its increasing presence with a mix of awe and dread, as if they sensed a shift in the nature of war itself. Why was this weapon spreading so quickly? The answer lies not just in its physical power, but in what it represented. Medieval warfare had long been dominated by the mounted knight, a noble warrior encased in expensive armor, trained from early childhood to fight with spear, sword, and lance. The knight was not just a military asset, he was a symbol of the feudal world. His superiority on the battlefield reinforced his superiority in society. But the crossbow undermined that ancient hierarchy. For the first time in centuries, a low-born soldier with minimal training could threaten the life of an elite warrior. The crossbow didn't require years of practice like the English longbow, whose archers often began training from childhood. It didn't require enormous strength. It didn't even require courage. A man could kneel behind a wall, shield, or battlement, load the weapon at his own pace, and release a bolt powerful enough to pierce heavy mail and even plate armor at distances up to 200 yards. This was terrifying for the knightly class. One chronicler wrote that with this treacherous weapon, a coward could slay the bravest of men without risk. And he wasn't exaggerating. The crossbow stripped away the idea that bravery, nobility, or a lifetime of training offered safety on the battlefield. Such was the moral panic surrounding the weapon that in 1139, the Second Lateran Council, one of the great church councils of the Middle Ages, condemned the crossbow as odious to God, threatening excommunication for anyone who used it against other Christians. The irony, of course, is that it remained perfectly acceptable to use against infidels, especially during the Crusades. But the Church's attempt to ban the weapon only proves how disruptive it had become. The crossbow didn't care about social rank. It didn't care about the centuries-old traditions of European warfare. It didn't care about chivalry, honor, or lineage. It was simply efficient, devastatingly so. And it began to rewrite the rules of combat. By the 12th century, the crossbow was everywhere. From the hills of Italy to the castles of Germany, from English ports to Mediterranean crusader strongholds, it was becoming the signature weapon of a new kind of soldier, the professional infantryman. And this was only the beginning. As it spread, it grew more powerful, more sophisticated, and more feared. In the next part, we'll explore just how devastating this small mechanical device truly became, and why it terrified the medieval world. Part 2. The devastating power of the crossbow. If Part 1 showed how the crossbow entered medieval Europe like a whisper, Part 2 reveals how it soon roared across the battlefield, feared, hated, and undeniably effective. To understand why this compact weapon reshaped warfare, we must look closely at what it could actually do. At its core, the medieval crossbow was a marvel of simple engineering. A short bow mounted horizontally on a wooden stock, a groove to guide the bolt, and a trigger mechanism that allowed a soldier to release stored energy with precision. But this simple construction concealed a terrifying amount of force. The most powerful crossbows of the Middle Ages could penetrate armor, even the finest steel plate, at ranges up to 200 yards, about 180 meters. And that statistic alone changed everything. Knights had long relied on heavy armor to protect them from swords, spears, and arrows. Their plate armor wasn't just protection, it was a symbol of status, a badge of untouchable superiority. But the crossbow didn't care about status symbols, it made armor irrelevant. To medieval chroniclers, this was nothing short of shocking. The knight, the centerpiece of feudal military power, could now be killed by a farmer with a day's training. And unlike the longbow, the crossbow didn't demand enormous strength or lifelong practice. English longbowmen, for example, trained from childhood, often developing enlarged bone structures in their arms and shoulders from decades of heavy draw weights. Crossbowmen, by contrast, could be trained in a matter of hours or days because the mechanical device did most of the work. This ease of use was part of why the Church feared the crossbow so much. As the history describes, the Second Lateran Council in 1139 condemned the weapon as odious to God due to the horrific wounds it caused, banning its use against Christians under threat of excommunication. Yet the ban did nothing. Kings and commanders adopted the weapon enthusiastically, recognizing its terrifying battlefield potential. But the crossbow's power wasn't limited to sheer penetration. It also offered something longbows struggled with: stability and precision. Because a crossbow could remain loaded indefinitely, the shooter didn't need to hold a heavy draw while taking aim. They could crouch behind a shield, perch on a battlement, or hide behind castle stonework, waiting patiently, silently, for the perfect moment. When an enemy knight exposed himself for even a second, the bolt was already loaded, ready to fly. This gave crossbowmen an enormous advantage during sieges. The compact design made it possible to shoot through narrow arrow slits, from tight corners, or from the decks of ships, all places where longbows were unwieldy or impossible to use effectively. In medieval warfare, where sieges were more common than open-field battles, this made the crossbow invaluable. Castle defenders could remain mostly hidden, protected by thick walls and parapets, reloading behind cover before popping out briefly to fire again. It was the perfect weapon for the static, grinding warfare of fortified positions. But as powerful as the crossbow was, it wasn't perfect. Compared to the longbow, its rate of fire was painfully slow. A well-trained longbowman might shoot 6 arrows in the time it took a crossbowman to fire one. Yet this disadvantage didn't matter in the situations where crossbows shined: ambushes, sieges, defensive positions, and naval warfare. In those environments, accuracy and armor penetration mattered far more than rate of fire. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the crossbow, however, was psychological. The medieval knight believed deeply in the values of courage, skill, and honorable combat. But the crossbow rewarded none of these traits. It could be fired by someone with no noble blood, no martial education, and no physical training. It allowed the common man, a shepherd, a porter, a fisherman, to kill someone considered his superior in every aspect of medieval society. This was the true threat the crossbow posed, not just military, but social. And that threat wasn't theoretical. It famously claimed the life of King Richard the Lionheart in 1199, when a seemingly minor bolt wound became infected and killed him days later. Even kings, the highest of the high, were not safe. In the next part, we'll explore how the crossbow's strengths made it the ultimate siege weapon, and how it reshaped the design of castles, towers, and defensive warfare itself. Part 3. Tactical advantages and the crossbow as the ultimate siege weapon. To truly understand why the crossbow became one of the most transformative weapons of the medieval world, we have to shift our focus away from the romanticized image of knights charging across open fields. The true battlefield of the Middle Ages was not the meadow, it was the wall. Castles, fortresses, fortified towns, and siege lines dominated warfare for centuries. And in this environment, the crossbow rose to unmatched prominence. One of the crossbow's greatest strengths was its remarkable stability. A longbow demanded that an archer draw, hold, aim, and release all in one continuous motion, a movement requiring strength, precision, and years of training. The crossbow, by contrast, separated these steps. It allowed the shooter to load the weapon behind cover, take aim without physical strain, and release a bolt with mechanical consistency. Once cocked, a crossbow could remain ready to fire indefinitely, turning every window, battlement, and arrow slit into a potential kill zone. This mechanical nature made the weapon especially deadly during sieges. A defender on a castle wall could stay hidden behind stone, load the crossbow safely, then lean out only for a split second to fire before disappearing again. The exposure time was minimal, which meant the risk was minimal. Longbows were powerful, but they required archers to remain visible for longer moments. A dangerous disadvantage when enemy bolts, stones, and darts filled the air. Castle design began to adapt to this new reality. Narrow arrow slits became optimized for crossbow use. Defenders could shoot from tight, protected positions that a longbow simply couldn't accommodate. The weapon's compact frame made it ideal for cramped interiors, parapets, tower rooms, and gatehouses. Medieval warfare was filled with bottlenecks, choke points, and confined spaces, and the crossbow excelled in all of them. Naval combat also benefited from the crossbow's unique strengths. On the rocking deck of a ship, drawing a longbow was incredibly difficult. Ropes, masts, sails, and the unpredictable movement of the sea made it almost impossible to use a bow effectively. But a crossbow could be loaded behind a mast or barricade, held steady, and fired accurately during brief openings. This advantage made crossbowmen essential on medieval fleets, especially in close-range sea skirmishes. Ambushes and urban combat amplified the crossbow's utility. In the tight alleys of a besieged town, a soldier could hide behind a wagon or stone corner with the weapon already cocked, releasing a bolt the instant an enemy appeared. It didn't require strength, rhythm, or fluid motion. It required timing, and timing could be taught to almost anyone. That was another key advantage: accessibility. Longbow mastery required decades of conditioning, creating an elite class of specialized archers. The crossbow broke this exclusivity. A townsman, merchant, or even a farmer with no martial background could become a competent crossbowman in a matter of hours. In a siege situation, where civilians often joined the defense of their own city, this democratization of lethal force changed outcomes dramatically. Ordinary people could suddenly stand shoulder to shoulder with trained soldiers and make a meaningful difference. Professional crossbow units amplified these benefits even further. Many operated in teams. One man held a large shield for protection, another loaded the weapon, and the shooter focused entirely on aiming and firing. This teamwork compensated for the crossbow's slower rate of fire, ensuring a steady rhythm of deadly bolts. Above all, the crossbow instilled fear. Knights approaching a fortified wall knew that armor, the pride of their status, offered little protection. Hidden defenders could strike at any moment, from any angle, from any slit in the stone. The uncertainty was terrifying. In the world of medieval fortifications, where holding a wall could determine the fate of kingdoms, the crossbow was more than a weapon. It was a force multiplier, a defender's equalizer, and the mechanical heartbeat of siege warfare. And this leads us directly into the next chapter, the rise of the legendary Genoese crossbowmen, perhaps the most feared mercenary force of the Middle Ages. Part 4. The Genoese crossbowmen, the elite mercenaries who ruled the battlefield. If the crossbow reshaped medieval warfare, then the Genoese crossbowmen perfected it. Among all the soldiers who ever wielded this weapon, none earned a reputation as formidable, disciplined, and universally feared as the men from Genoa. They weren't just crossbowmen. They were specialists, craftsmen of death, and the most sought-after mercenaries of their age. To understand why, we need to look at the world that produced them. Genoa was a maritime powerhouse, its wealth built on trade, shipbuilding, and a culture of relentless competition. The city's artisans created some of the finest crossbows in Europe, produced by the highly respected Balistri Corporation, a guild that turned weapon-making into a science. In Genoa, the crossbow wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of skill, pride, and economic power. From this environment emerged soldiers who transformed the crossbow from a simple mechanical weapon into an art form. Genoese crossbowmen operated with a level of organization rare in medieval infantry. They fought in teams of 3, the shooter, a shield-bearer, and an assistant loader. The shield-bearer carried a massive pavis, a towering rectangular shield often as tall as a man, which could be planted into the ground to create instant mobile cover. While the shooter aimed and fired, the assistant loaded a second crossbow, ensuring a continuous rhythm of deadly bolts. This teamwork compensated for the weapon's slow rate of fire and made the Genoese one of the few infantry units capable of sustaining pressure on heavily armored knights. This synergy and precision set them apart. They were feared not only because they used crossbows, but because they used them better than anyone else. Their rise to fame began during the Crusades. At the Siege of Jerusalem and later at the Battle of Jaffa, Genoese crossbowmen earned admiration from both Christian and Muslim chroniclers. Their bolts tore through armor, dropped charging cavalry, and held defensive positions with unnerving efficiency. Commanders quickly realized that hiring a contingent of Genoese crossbowmen could tilt the balance of an entire campaign. Even kings understood their value. Despite the crossbow's controversial reputation, rulers across Europe paid top coin to secure Genoese companies. Their services were expensive, and for good reason. These men were professionals in an age when warfare was still dominated by nobles and part-time soldiers. They trained, marched, and fought as a unified body. They were reliable, disciplined, and deadly. But their reputation also came with a darker side, one that made them both respected and hated. Genoese crossbowmen were so effective that enemies often treated them with extraordinary cruelty when captured. In one infamous episode, after suffering losses at the hands of Genoese mercenaries, Emperor Frederick II ordered that captured crossbowmen have their fingers cut off, effectively destroying their livelihood. It was a brutal punishment, but it shows just how threatening these men were considered. Their fame reached its peak in the 13th and 14th centuries, when they served in armies across Italy, France, Spain, and the Mediterranean. Wherever they went, they became the backbone of siege defenses and a terror for charging cavalry. A line of Genoese crossbowmen behind their pavises could stop even the most determined knightly charge. And yet, despite their skill, they became tragically immortalized by one disastrous moment, the Battle of Crécy in 1346. On that day, fighting for the French crown, thousands of Genoese crossbowmen marched onto the field under a pouring rain. Their bowstrings became soaked, losing tension and power. Meanwhile, the English longbowmen, who had kept their strings dry, unleashed a relentless storm of arrows. The Genoese pavises had been left behind in the French camp, a fatal mistake. Without protection and unable to match the longbow's rate of fire, the Genoese suffered catastrophic losses. It was a humiliation, but not because they lacked skill. They were simply betrayed by conditions, command failures, and misfortune. Even after Crécy, their legacy didn't fade. Long after gunpowder weapons emerged, long after the crossbow itself began to decline, the legend of the Genoese crossbowmen endured. Their mastery represented the height of pre-modern military professionalism, a reminder that technology alone does not win wars, but the men who wield it with discipline and strategy. In the next part, we'll explore the defining clash between the crossbow and the longbow, and how this rivalry shaped some of the most iconic battles of the medieval world. Part 5. Crossbow versus longbow, the clash at Crécy. The medieval battlefield was always a place of shifting power, but few moments symbolized the clash of military philosophies as dramatically as the Battle of Crécy in 1346. It wasn't just a battle between England and France, it was a duel between two radically different weapons, the longbow and the crossbow. Each had shaped armies, strategies, and social structures. At Crécy, they finally met in a confrontation that would echo through the centuries. To understand the magnitude of this clash, you must picture the setting. The English army, led by King Edward III, had taken position on a slope, the perfect terrain for long-range archers. The French forces were larger, richer, and backed by hundreds of armored knights, the pride of medieval Europe. And at the front of their formation stood thousands of Genoese crossbowmen, among the finest mercenaries in the world. What happened next has been retold for centuries. Before the battle began, a heavy rain drenched the field. To the longbowmen of England, this was barely a setback. They simply unstrung their bows, kept the strings dry, and waited. But the Genoese crossbows suffered a fatal disadvantage. Their strings were made of materials that absorbed water. As the rain soaked into them, tension dropped, power faded, and the bolts lost both range and penetrating force. When the storm passed, the Genoese crossbowmen marched forward, but their weapons were crippled. And yet the French commanders ordered them to advance anyway. The English longbowmen watched as the mercenaries approached, slow and exposed on the open field. Then, with the discipline that had made them legendary, they raised their bows. At Crécy, a trained longbowman could release 5 or even 6 arrows in the time it took a crossbowman to fire one. And now, with the Genoese unable to rely on their pavises, left behind astonishingly in the French camp, there was nothing to shield them. The sky darkened with English arrows. Wave after wave tore into the advancing crossbowmen. Bolts from wet crossbows couldn't reach the English lines. Their shots fell short. Their formation collapsed. Panic spread. And in one of the most shocking and tragic moments of the battle, their own allies turned against them. Furious that the Genoese were retreating, French knights charged forward, cutting down the very men they had hired. The field became a slaughter. But the humiliation of the Genoese at Crécy was not a failure of skill. It was a failure of leadership, logistics, and preparation. They had been thrown into battle handicapped without cover, against an enemy perfectly positioned with superior rate of fire. No crossbow unit, not even the best in the world, could have survived those odds. Still, Crécy marked a turning point. It demonstrated the raw, overwhelming power of massed longbow fire in open field battles. For historians, it became the symbol of longbow dominance. But that interpretation misses a larger truth. Despite the disaster at Crécy, the crossbow did not disappear. It remained essential across Europe for generations. Why? Because the longbow's strengths worked brilliantly in very specific conditions: high ground, open fields, dry weather, and disciplined troops trained from childhood. Crossbows remained unmatched in sieges, urban warfare, naval engagements, tight spaces, and defensive positions. They were easier to train, easier to use, and far more practical for everyday soldiers. Crécy was a victory for the longbowmen of England, but not the death of the crossbow. In fact, in the centuries after Crécy, crossbows grew even stronger. Steel prods replaced wooden ones. Winding mechanisms like the windlass and cranaquin amplified power to unimaginable levels. They continued to dominate castle walls and fortified positions long after gunpowder appeared. And even when firearms finally pushed them aside, hunters kept using crossbows for another 150 years because of their silence and precision. The Battle of Crécy was many things: a tactical revolution, a catastrophe for the Genoese, and a triumph for English archery. But above all, it was a reminder that no weapon rules forever. Every battlefield has its own conditions, and it is those conditions, not legends, that decide which weapons rise or fall. In the final part, we'll explore the crossbow's lasting legacy and how it reshaped not just warfare but the social order of the medieval world. Part 6. The lasting legacy of the crossbow in medieval warfare. By the time the Middle Ages reached their final chapters, the crossbow had already carved its legacy deep into the history of warfare. Few weapons left such a complex and transformative mark. It was feared, banned, embraced, improved, and eventually overshadowed, but never forgotten. To understand its true legacy, we need to look beyond the battlefield and into the very structure of medieval society. The first undeniable impact of the crossbow was its challenge to the dominance of the armored knight. For centuries, mounted nobles had ruled the battlefield as symbols of military and social superiority. Their armor represented invincibility, their training represented prestige, their presence inspired fear or respect. But when a single crossbow bolt could pierce even the finest armor, that sense of invulnerability began to crumble. This shift had profound consequences. Armies began relying more on infantry, trained soldiers, mercenaries, and even common townsmen, and less on noble cavalry. Feudal power structures, long supported by the knightly class, faced a weapon that leveled the field, literally and socially. Warfare no longer belonged exclusively to the elite. It was becoming more technical, more professional, and more democratic. A simple mechanical device challenged centuries of tradition. The crossbow also forced advancements in armor design. As bolts grew more powerful, and as steel prods replaced wooden bows, armorers were pushed into a technological arms race. They experimented with thicker plates, better tempering, fluting, and angled surfaces. Some of the most iconic suits of late medieval armor exist because craftsmen were trying to counter the raw force of crossbow bolts. But the innovation didn't stop with armor. Castle design itself adapted. Narrow embrasures, optimized firing angles, protected firing galleries, and deeper battlements emerged as defenders sought to maximize the advantages of crossbow use. Fortifications became more sophisticated, not just because of sieges, but because defenders needed spaces where crossbowmen could survive and dominate. Meanwhile, on the technological front, the crossbow's evolution exploded. Simple wooden designs gave way to laminated prods, then steel ones. Hand-drawn bows were replaced by mechanical spanning devices, belt hooks, lever systems, goat's foot levers, and later windlasses and cranaquins capable of generating thousands of pounds of draw weight. By the 15th century, some crossbows packed enough force to pierce armor at astonishing distances, rivaling early firearms in raw penetrating power. Yet even as gunpowder weapons entered European arsenals, the crossbow refused to die. Muskets were loud, slow to reload, and required controlled production of gunpowder. Crossbows were silent, compact, and reliable. Hunters in particular loved them. For more than 150 years after firearms became common, the crossbow remained the preferred weapon for quiet killing, a testament to its enduring practicality. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the crossbow's legacy is cultural. Throughout medieval Europe, it symbolized fear, controversy, and moral panic. The Church's attempt to ban its use among Christians showed just how disruptive it had become. It represented everything that medieval society struggled with: the rise of common soldiers, the decline of noble supremacy, and the unsettling idea that a low-born man could kill a king. And one eventually did, ending the life of Richard the Lionheart. Some saw the crossbow as treacherous, others saw it as liberation, but no one could ignore it. By the dawn of the Renaissance, warfare had changed forever. Professional armies were replacing feudal levies, infantry was beginning to dominate, and technology, not lineage, was becoming the defining factor of military power. The crossbow stands at the heart of that transformation. It was the first medieval weapon to blur the boundaries between elite and common, the first to force technological innovation in both armor and castle engineering, the first to spread military power more evenly across society, and the first to demonstrate that mechanical ingenuity could reshape the world just as dramatically as brute strength or noble birth. In many ways, the crossbow was the bridge between ancient combat and the age of modern warfare. A quiet revolution carried not on horseback, but on the shoulder of an ordinary soldier. And in our final segment, we'll tie together everything the crossbow meant to the Middle Ages and explore why its story still fascinates us today. The story of the medieval crossbow is the story of a quiet revolution, one that didn't happen with dramatic speeches or grand declarations, but with the simple pull of a trigger. In an age defined by armored knights, towering castles, and rigid social hierarchies, the crossbow emerged as a force that defied all expectations. It ignored titles, challenged tradition, and delivered power into the hands of ordinary men. It changed warfare not through elegance or chivalry, but through pure mechanical efficiency. On the battlefield, it shattered the illusion of invincibility. Behind the walls of besieged cities, it gave courage to defenders who otherwise would have stood no chance. In the hands of elite mercenaries like the Genoese, it became a symbol of professionalism and deadly precision. And across Europe, it pushed technology forward, inspiring improvements in armor, fortifications, engineering, and military organization. Even after gunpowder arrived, the crossbow refused to disappear quietly. Its silence, accuracy, and reliability kept it alive for generations, and its legacy endured long after its bolts stopped flying. Today, the crossbow stands as a reminder that even the smallest innovations can reshape the world. It was a weapon that disrupted the old order, empowered the common soldier, and forced medieval society to confront a new reality. In the end, it is not nobility or tradition that determines power, but the tools humanity creates. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most fascinating weapons of the Middle Ages. Welcome to medieval crazy history, where the past is always crazier than you think.